Good morning, everyone. Whoever chooses to watch this fascinating interview with Dr. Roger Miles, um, a recently met colleague we met on LinkedIn, and in the very specific context of the research that we both kind of are interested in, which is mostly was it human behavior and cognitive psychology and corporate business, behavioral science and behavioral public policy, as well as
Quite so.
all of that feeding into AI and the digital infrastructures of today. So I'm super excited because we had three conversations, I think, by now. And so we kind of got to know each other a bit, but I'm
Indeed.
anxious to share with my network your ideas, Roger. And if you don't mind drawing background, all I can say is that Roger has worked for a couple of decades now, or a bit longer.
Oh, a little longer than
A
that, but
little
we'll
longer
get
than
into
that
that.
within corporate sectors and financial
Yeah.
sectors. And throughout all these years, there's quite fascinating twists and turns of his story, how you got into what you are doing now, which is similar to what I'm interested in: cognitive security, cognitive liberty, some people say. And it's all about, as I see it, and it seems like we agree on that point, that human autonomy is premium, not only from the point of it being a humane approach to another human being, human being, having a humane society where we try to be have autonomy and have conversations and feel free to make our own choices, but also from the standpoint of maybe some business people will be interested to hear how that kind of background where that really affects when unethical behavior and behavior that seems to be rational according to
Yes.
some people, but for others, maybe it turns out not to be so rational, can be very detrimental to businesses and massive systems,
Mm.
as we know. So go ahead, Roger, and have a go at presenting your massive portfolio to us.
Huh.
I will let you speak for 10 minutes or so.
Let me try and reduce sort of more than 20 years work into just a couple of minutes. So the reason that the thinking came together really into sharp focus for me about 2 years ago, around about the time that ChatGPT was making waves and getting started, was I realized that in hindsight, and we're all very good with hindsight, right? There is a thread that links together the past kind of more than 30 years of my work. And that's because I started as a literature major and then did a linguistics option for my master's. Then, as a lot of people of my generation did with arts degrees, because it was the 80s, the 90s, we went into business training because that's where the money was if you were an arts graduate. So I worked in accountancy and investor relations, and then in corporate lobbying groups for the banking industry, various things. I mentioned as a sort of funny career highlight from those days that I was on a committee for the British government looking at the millennium bug risk. And I got very interested in these ideas of risk communications, how it is that we make sense, how we use language to frame our sentient experience of risk. We see risk coming at us, and then we start using labels, language, dispute even to try and make sense of what is going on. And I realized, having worked in and around the banking sector for, at that point, more than a decade, that there seemed to be a fault line between the way that rules were drawn up and the behavior that I observed to be happening. And I think the thing about a literature and language background is it's kind of a form of anthropology. So great literature, a good writer, whether it's like a Hollywood script writer or a novelist from, back in Victorian times or whatever, or a playwright, all of these people are fine observers of human nature, or as we might now call them, behavioral scientists or anthropologists. It's all very much the same thought space. So my challenge was observing the financial sector at work. The rules seemed to be set around looking in the wrong direction. So just to take a very simple technical example, which hopefully some of your listeners will recognize, financial regulation up to the crash of 2008 was based very much on a thing called value at risk. which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the technical structure of contracts, it's the legal premise, it's the market valuation, it's the ability to say, here is the price of what we're looking at, and here is an agreed value on the contract, which is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with focusing on value. It is, after all, what financial markets do. Just that there's a whole other story going on in the background, or if you like, the duck paddling underwater, the behavior, the way that people interact with people. And it's really clear. And by the way, I'm not saying we discovered this in 2008. Actually, I discovered it at a conference in the Netherlands in 1993, which is what set this thought process going, that maybe we should be designing rules based on our observation of how human beings interact, rather than simply the structure of market pricing and contract law. So I took some time out. I was able to, just take a step back from the industry in the early noughties and write my PhD. And I suggested, observing financial markets in 2006-07, interesting timing, that we should apply a more behavioural lens to markets. And in fact, that you could reduce to probably 4 or 5 key indicators of behaviour. The health, the engagement, the trustworthiness, the quality of market making. And also, extrapolating from that, we could predict when markets might fail because the transparency was missing, the trust was eroding, the prices were overheating or whatever. So there's some elements of the old VAR model, value at risk model, in this new thing that we call behavior at risk now, or shortened to conduct risk in the new regulation. Anyway, cut a long story short, I published my thesis, the markets crashed, and my phone started ringing a lot from regulators and banks saying, oh, you may be onto something here. And let's just say for the last, 15 plus years, I've been kept quite happily busy with helping banks to design their what is increasingly called culture reporting or conduct risk reporting, and in conversations with regulators all around the world, because this idea is not, I'm saying I invented the idea, I just was kind of working in a hot topic space. But I've published a couple of books off these conversations. I've interviewed several thousand people throughout the financial sector, many of them governance leaders, and I've observed the patterns of their behavior or the stories that they tell about what just happened, which is a good approximation of, the story doesn't have to be literally true. We make sense of risk by telling stories to each other. That's an important part of the process. So I've had these conversations with leaders, risk takers, governance people, regulators around, are we looking in the right direction? Do we need to use different measures, MI as they call it, different indicators? And how could we do this better? And I'm very happy to say that a lot of these ideas have now been taken up again. I'm not claiming primacy. All I did, actually, like a good PhD, I interviewed a lot of people, so there was some original research, but I also synthesized a stack of, at that point, about half a century's worth of what we now call behavioral economics. But back in the early 2000s, we didn't really have the term behavioral economics. It was just a funny kind of anthropological spin-off from economics, and a lot of, let's now call them classical economists, were a little bit skeptical about it. What I would say now is that if I'm teaching, very often the kids want to learn about behavioral economics. They don't really care about classical economics so much, because they can see that in many ways what we do now with these tools gives us better answers than the stuff that we used to use. So what do I do day to day? Well, half my time probably is spent working in-house, normally with banks. The other half of it is working with standard setting bodies. So I was with, obviously I can't name them, a major agency of His Majesty's government this morning, convening a global conference on standard setting in, let's call it culture assessment, looking at the how engaged are people in ethical behavior in their sectors. And actually this is cross-cutting across many sectors. It's not just finance.
Right. And this is when the first thing that comes to my mind when I first learned about your story of, having this initial experience of working with bankers, and then during your PhD, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understood it, you because you had already known those people, you you could reach out to them. They personally knew you, so
Yes,
it was easy for you to interview some of the major names in the sector, right? And that was
that's a good. Thank you, Adam, for
while,
that.
sorry,
So,
let me
well,
just,
the particular
while
pitch I had
challenging
to
them, right? As well, like because
right,
you were challenging them, you
yeah,
needed to have a relationship to challenge someone's behavior, let's say, somewhere in the
yeah. I
sector.
mean, I should mention at this point that I've been on the boards of some global consulting firms, and that and I've done close work with a number of the banks. I worked as a among other things, an advocate and a speechwriter to the chairman of a couple of the major high street banks in the UK. And yes, I was. I had a good address book, and what I was able to pitch to the university that took me on for a PhD was, I can get interviews with people that you can't otherwise. Otherwise you have no prospect of reaching because they're on speed dial already because I'm already working with them. And that enabled me to punch through the, I have to say, considerable skepticism that the
Right.
university
This is
has.
what I thought is
And
fascinating.
what
More
was
about that.
fascinating to me was, right, the first 2 years I was just toiling away, doing my interviews, compiling the thing, submitting the MPhil version of the thesis, and nobody really wanted to talk to me within the university. It was just, oh, he's that guy that sits in the corner and does that thing.
Hmm. Right.
And
And you
then
had the
just
prompter
after the
there.
M, right, just then as I did the MPhil, the markets crashed. So literally the week that I got my MPhil pass and upgrade to PhD, the markets crashed. And then suddenly
2008.
a couple of the
When Alan
professors,
Greenspan said, well, I had been going for 40 years and I didn't had no idea what's gonna
right,
happen because
yeah,
because also we will learn later on, hopefully, that the kind of rationality that was applied, the classical economics, well, over like there and then it proved to be inaccurate way of thinking about risk and uncertainty.
famously, I think it was Her Majesty the Queen who was doing a tour of the London School of Economics about a month after the market crash. And she said in that very low-key way of, very British understatement. So how come you didn't see any of this coming?
Yeah, we had certain view of what is rational,
Yes.
and now we have slightly different view, but it's still
So I didn't
changing.
look, to be clear, Adam, I did not go into my research degree. I think I signed on at King's College in October 2006. If I had known then what was about to happen 2 years down the line, I would have written a very different thesis. And as it happens, when I presented the final PhD version, which was lodged after the market crash, actually it was quite difficult for me to have to take things which I've been writing in the sort of future conditional, if this, then that, and say, well, actually, it was this thing that just happened, which kind of proves the point that I was trying to make, that we
Mhm.
were looking at the wrong indicators all along.
And how did they respond to you being
Well,
scrutinizing their
what was,
work
yeah, so I
during the
took my,
PhD?
right, I got the MPhil PhD upgrade and the crash happened. And then the very next week, actually, I need to be very careful not to identify individuals here, but let's just say a couple of very senior people at the university who had barely given me the time of day before suddenly wanted to be my best friends. And I got invited to a lot of research groups for the government, for the regulator, for the banking industry, where previously, let's say the doors may not have been closed, but I may have walked past a few doors and sort of thought, I wonder what they're doing. Suddenly, I found a lot of doors opening, and I was getting invited into some very serious groups where we were developing the new approach to regulation. And what I've really enjoyed seeing from this is that germ of an idea that I saw at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in 1993. If those of you who are we've got any Dutch listeners, it's the Tafel van Elf. It's the 11 predeterminants of compliance, or what we call compliance intentionality or propensity. Um, I really just developed that and built on it and took it as a core idea. By the way, the Dutch government themselves used that for what they then called culture audit, which was a phrase I'm very happy to use and propagate, and I have done in my own work. And we now find that there are more than 50 central government regulatory bodies around the world who specifically espouse this way of thinking, who specifically use this behavioral design approach to developing regulation. And it's fantastic because it means I'm out there in the conversation. I often get calls from people who I've not previously had conversation with, but they've read something or they've been at a conference where my work has been presented or whatever. And it's just brilliant because it's sort of snowballed, it just keeps on rolling now. And I'm very happy now to be slightly taking a step back, actually, and just watching it run.
And would you say the culture in the corporate sector, in the government sector, is the culture, despite the kind of, it's a less quantifiable measure, I guess, to talk about behavior rather than talk about, the previous way of approaching it. Is it really turning into mainstream, or how would you say that? Because we also know that there's many nudge units, and the nudging approach is in
Yeah,
this more
let me deal
previous,
with
like,
nudging specifically because nudge peaked actually just after
just
I
after
did my
2008, right?
thesis. So
12, 10.
nudge really kind of hit the headlines, and that it was. I think if I had to isolate a single event that brought behavioral economics into the mainstream or into public consciousness, it was the publication of Sunstein and Thaler's Nudge book
Nudge.
in, if my memory serves, it was
Hey,
2010, might be
2008, I
2009,
think
2010.
published, but then I
Right.
think in the
But it
policy,
really kind of hit the government mainstream after the financial crash. So we had the change of government. The Gordon Brown government fell. We then had David Cameron, who
Cameron,
was
that was the
very
first time the first nudge unit was founded
right. So we had
on like
Obama in America and
2010.
Cameron in the UK, both of whom were huge fans of Nudge. For two reasons. There's the, let's call it the shiny public reason, which is this is good science and we understand better about people. So yes, let's use this. The, let's call it a bit more backroom reason is, of course, nudge economics is much cheaper to use as a design tool than developing advanced detailed legislation. You can change behavior very quickly and very cheaply with a well-designed behavioral intervention. The problem now, a generation on from that, so fast forward 15 years, is nudge has been co-opted malignly by vested interests in various sectors. I don't really want to get into detail and challenge because this is a lot of the work that I do, in private with branded organizations and indeed with government. If it's possible to get let's just take a simple example.
Even commercial aspect is.
Let me give you a published example. And again, there's a great paper by a couple of behavioral scientists kind of recanting on their own work on nudge. So Lowenstein and Chater published a paper called The I Frame and the S Frame, very influential, about 4 years ago, I think now, saying actually all that work that we did a decade ago on nudging, we're slightly disowning that now because nudging has been abused and co-opted as a tool of lobbying by vested interests. So just to take one example that they use in the paper, the oil industry. And by the way, I've worked for the oil industry. I'm not, I've worked for all kinds of.
You've done the dark side, and then you became a Jedi.
Yeah, I mean, one reason I moved to the research side is kind of I saw how the dark side game is played, and I thought, interesting to look at that from the other side of the fence, maybe. So the oil industry devised this idea of the carbon footprint, which is a way of displacing responsibility from the producer side of the formula onto the consumer side of the formula. So you could argue actually with many industries, whether it's, I don't know, food, pharmaceuticals, extractive industries, energy, wholesale finance, that if the system is creating an imbalance, to the advantage of the producer and the disadvantage of the consumer, surely one role of government is to try and reset that balance so that consumers are not disadvantaged. And you could argue that this is kind of a narrative that explains a lot of regulation. And I like to reach back, and we've talked about this, Adam, before, back into industrial history. You can see that with the advent of each new technology, the technology kind of overwhelms people's sensibility and it overwhelms government's ability to control for a while. And then there's typically there's a catastrophic incident, and then you get a pushback, and then there's legislation. And maybe for a while the balance is reset until the next wave of technology comes along. And I'm very interested in, for example, we've had the first wave of social media
Right.
interrupting people's social lives. Now we've got the second wave with generative AI kind of advancing and developing that. We haven't really got the first wave sorted out because
We
social
haven't
media
we
is
haven't
still
discussed it. We haven't reflected
right.
and debriefed. Right.
Social media is causing, and we know this. You don't have to look.
Yeah.
It's causing
Yeah.
immense social
Right.
harms. It's causing an absolute epidemic of,
Massive.
teenage
And
illnesses, self-harming, all kinds of stuff.
right, and the
And we haven't
science,
even got across that yet, let alone the
exactly.
impact that generative AI and particularly deep fakes and this kind of knowledge churn. We'll maybe come on to that a little later, but AI is producing this tidal wave of unqualified information. And
Sure.
there is no precedent in human history for this effect on the collective consciousness. I think actually the nearest precedent we can probably find is Gutenberg and the printing press in the 1400s.
Totally. If not,
You know,
if not,
suddenly
maybe
knowledge,
literacy. If possibly 2,000 years
right?
ago, maybe
So
alphabetic
or
literacy
maybe the
comes
invention
about.
of writing, actually, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great one. You know, the devising of written text. So
Yeah.
from knowledge, I think Gutenberg is more about it's like the democratizing of knowledge in the way that written
Intermediary.
text.
Yeah, possibly.
You know, because you had to be
Harari.
wealthy to own a book. You know, writing was invented, but actually the only people who could afford books were wealthy and
But
therefore could control knowledge. What Gutenberg did, okay, he copied a Chinese model, and we could talk about that, but let's not.
sure, that's a
Um,
different topic.
what what the invention of printing generically did was democratize knowledge, and suddenly it became incredibly hard for the controllers of power to then control social knowledge.
Which is also, but yes, I think about this a lot as well. And it's democratized it just as alphabetic literacy democratized ideographic literacy was much harder to
Right.
learn before we had the vowel, right? But then also it decontextualized it, interestingly, like telegraph, for
Yeah, so
example,
I know what you
later
mean. The
on.
kind of the artifacts of knowledge. You
You
could
don't
kind of
have the intermediaries, so you
yeah,
can
they weren't anchored to the monasteries or
exactly,
to
and
the
the
crown
context.
or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah, so you could have authoritarian aspect of being within having to have a middleman,
sure.
but and that was the malignant perhaps aspect of it. But then there was also this
Mm,
kind of fostering a tradition, and there was a more controlled environment for imparting that knowledge, right? Where suddenly like
mm,
printing made it, yeah, okay, it's now more people can read the Bible, most of them, and maybe
right.
not so much
No,
of other stuff, right? But still they could then have Luther and other people
right. So you have, you have
interpreting for
Tyndale
yourself.
in English, you have Luther in Germany, and and suddenly it becomes possible for people for whom the Bible was, you had to speak Latin in order to understand what was going on in church. Therefore, by definition, you had to be educated and therefore probably wealthy and therefore probably, controlling classes. It was not Latin was not the language of ordinary people at that time. So, in the same way that translating these texts into common language create a liberation, and you then get this kind of breakdown of hierarchies, control systems. If you can directly challenge the system of control, then there are two more or less opposite possibilities. One is you can improve it, the other is you can destroy it.
Right.
The problem we now have with social media is actually not a direct replication of that. This is going off in a whole different direction. If all the world's knowledge is so, and we kind of had this when the internet first arrived, suddenly all of human knowledge is accessible through a search window. But this is actually the second or third. If the generation one was Google, say, generation two was social media. So now each of us can actively contribute or associate with this knowledge. Third generation,
And
generative
publish
AI,
and self-publish, right?
right? Generative
Decentralized
AI is
publishing.
the next stage of that. So it's multiplying. The problem is the thing it is multiplying is not knowledge. It's a lot of it is opinion
A lot of
because
it is rubbish. Yeah.
it's learning material, it's LLM feed. Okay, some of what's fed into the large language models is textbooks, and even textbooks are not 100% reliable, by the way. They're often based on a school of thought rather than an
Exactly.
absolute
Exactly.
truth. I would say even there's no, well, let's not go to get into definitions of absolute truth, but I like to annoy accountants and auditors and actuaries by saying a number is not a truth. A statistic is simply an outcome of somebody's observation. The observation is based on a model. The model is based on assumptions. The running of the observation may be using instruments, where the instruments are being used by somebody who doesn't understand how to use the instrument. The aggregation of statistics at the end of the text might be done, using averages. Well, averages are never truths. You've got,
Right.
okay, if you've got a group of 2,000 individual statistical readouts, you average them, there's something in the middle. that one average figure is not a general truth about the data set. It's not specific in any way.
Mhm.
So I mean, I don't want to get into high levels of the philosophical theory of statistics here, but we've got to be so careful not to say that because something has a statistic, that that statistic is an absolute truth. It's only ever an observation based on a set of assumptions.
And based on that, let's say a question that is subjectively, someone came up with that question to
Right.
get objective data, right? So
I mean,
there's always personality somewhere that I think part of what we have in common in our respective fields, I think is the language that you come from, and I also, I'm close to language, and is this in-betweenness with language gives you this insight into a world of the person who uses the language, right? So even if you
right.
have objective measures, objectively presented data, and so on, there is always an element of contingency there, and
Yeah.
right.
Let's ground this in the point about LLMs for a minute, because I kind of nearly concluded on that and then we veered off, as I tend to.
Go ahead.
Large language models are learning. Okay, so we've got literature, we've got, let's call it the scientific literature, the textbooks, okay, which are generally more grounded in truth, although they often base in kind of models of truth gathering, which themselves might be flawed. You've got then the body of, let's call it literature, storytelling, a lot of which is socially useful. Look at the works of Charles Dickens or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or great novelists.
There are truths about human nature, human
There are great
relationship.
truth. They're very good at understanding truths of human nature, and that's why they're like with a good Hollywood movie, it's popular because it resonates with people's experience, and that's the good thing about great literature, great writing, great storytelling, playwriting, whatever. That's fantastic. Then you've got the rest of the stuff that the LLMs are kind of scooping up from you know, the worldwide, whatever you
Cyberspace.
want, when I call it cyberspace. Um, Show my age calling it the worldwide web.
Yeah, but that's so
Um,
much noise, right? In that space.
right. Where and increasingly the loudness with which you express an opinion is the thing that matters, not how grounded you are in empirical truth. If indeed there ever was such a thing as empirical truth. But what we seem to be, we kind of cut ourselves adrift from constructive challenge, from critical thinking, from analysis.
And
And the
even
worry
dialogue,
is that,
right? Even
right,
dialogue, because there's so much polarized opinion fighting
well,
each other.
the worry is that the machines, which are becoming incredibly good at talking to us, and by the way, they're exploit again behavioral science. This thing called the Barnum effect, which is very similar to the Turing test. Is this a machine or a person talking to me? So you're sitting behind a screen. There's a voice coming through the screen from the curtain, as it were, the other side. You can't tell whether the voice is a machine or a human being. We're already way past that, and AI is it's very very good at mimicking right down to hesitation, drawing breath, repeating itself. All that stuff.
Pretending it feels something, even like,
The developers have absolutely got across that thing that defeats our sense of, hang on a minute, this is not a machine, it's a person.
yeah.
And it's seductive, and we are very easily seduced. And my point is actually, to shorten the story a little, our evolved brains just cannot cope with
They're
this
hacked.
idea that we're talking to a
Exactly.
machine.
Yeah, yeah.
The
It's
machine
so
is
easy to
so
be
good, whether
deceived.
it's,
We are
you know,
so prone to being deceived, right?
right, whether it's me kind of bantering with Chat GPT, whether it's your home voice assistant talking to you as you come in the front door. And the worst, of course, impact of this is deepfake fraud,
Mm.
where the developers of those, so the organized crime and indeed the state-sponsored troll farms who develop deepfake AI for monetary gain, have absolutely worked out how good does that deepfake have to be in order just to clear the bar of, you know, we don't need to fool everybody, by the way, we just need to fool the weakest link. It's like the old story about the two guys being chased by a bear in the woods, and one looks over his shoulder at the other, and he says, "Look, can we just run faster?" He says, "Well, I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just have to run faster than you." We've already got to the point where the bear has actually overtaken the guy behind.
Mm.
So AI, deepfake AI is already more than capable of, let's call it what it is, seducing the trust of naive. I could say naive people. Actually, they're not naive, just normal humans.
It's
You
not
know,
our fault. We have not
unless you
evolved
are
to be challenged by those this level of those that kind of resolution of epistemic tool. It's an epistemic tool, effectively, right?
absolutely,
And
unless
it's
you are a
totally.
cognitive scientist who specializes in this stuff, unless you're very good at watching for the tells of actual human beings. AI is incredibly good at faking a human-like object,
Mm,
to the extent that the fraudsters using deepfakes absolutely realize how do you get lots of money out of a corporation? Well, the typical corporation has got, if you believe Microsoft's recent research on this, 45% of people working for large organizations. So organizations employing 100,000 plus people, which is a lot of organizations,
mm,
up to 45% of their workforce are either marginally skeptical or fully, don't believe anything that the boss says. The hackers know this. They've read the behavioral science textbooks and they are targeting those, what we used to call presentee people. So an absentee is somebody who's going to leave and doesn't bother coming into work or doesn't bother logging on.
mm,
A presentee is somebody who does come into work but is kind of off the program and looking for opportunities to break things. What
mm.
the hackers now know is that all they have to do is find one of those 45%, 100,000 people, that's 45,000 target opportunities.
Right.
Think
Okay.
about that. They only have to
Let's
get lucky once.
Yeah, and so now we can kind of link what we said before about, let's say, behavioral economics, behavioral science being weaponized. This original research is developing into this dark design patterns and.
I'll tell you what, the biggest readers of behavioral science now, or the most voracious. So, a barrister who I worked with years ago on anti money laundering stuff used to say financial criminals have an unlimited commitment to self education. Think about that.
Tell me,
Financial
I'm
crime is a
shattered.
direct self acting incentive. And with cybercrime, the great thing about it, if you're into organized crime, is that the barriers to entry are effectively zero. So unlike other forms of organized crime, like people trafficking, drug
Oh, you mean
running,
it's zero incentive to
guns,
learning from the
it has
experience
no.
because
Well,
there's
it has
hardly any
zero
backlash.
physical. It has almost zero physical footprint.
Almost there. Yes, exactly. This is
It's
what
not
happens with
liable to police
with digital stuff.
disruption.
Hmm.
So the law enforcement has a really hard time catching up with cybercrime because where is it?
And plus, to all of that, we have the pace of human decision making versus the development of technology and all of those
Right.
tools.
And Adam,
A
this is
different
this is my
curve,
point.
right?
So we're at a point in the evolutionary cycle where actually you could say maybe 25 years ago it was still possible for us as humans to recognize when the thing we were interacting with was mechanical.
Hmm.
I think we passed that kind of basic Turing test point probably 10 years ago when we started seeing, Hollywood made a bunch of movies about AI assistants, and is it Scarlett Johansson or is it, interesting sidebar, Scarlett Johansson is herself challenging the developers now for the, misuse of her voice or a synthetic copy of her voice. Talk about truth copying fiction. So we're now at a stage where actually the human brain as evolved is simply not capable for the average person. And look, I'm not going to say cognitive scientists and people specializing in this are infallible either. And I think what's interesting, some of the most senior people who've been duped by social engineering crime, by this form of cyber hacking,
Even experts, right?
are, they are the finance directors, they're the C-suite people in large financial firms who in their construct of the world say, oh no, I'm far too clever to be fooled by something as basic as that. Every single week now, I am seeing news reports of major, monetary losses in large organizations from social engineer hacking. And those
Right.
are, by the way, just the ones that we hear about. Obviously, that things that get reported only come out very reluctantly. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that doesn't get reported.
So do you agree with the statement that that MindShield, the company I've been involved with recently, do you agree with the statement that the human mind is the weakest link then, based on
Yes.
what you said, right? It's like we have all these infrastructures and these systems which are super advanced, but human psyche remains
I totally agree with that.
it's more vulnerable than ever, right? It's like no matter how much
Adam,
you
here's
talk about
yeah.
cybersecurity, that cognitive
You
security
see,
is
wrong again. Talking of framing and terminology, cybersecurity even is the wrong terminology.
wrong. Go
So
ahead.
the new generation of hackers are not hacking the machine; they're not hacking the IT. And simply having let's build a bigger firewall, let's buy some more boxes, let's have a stronger front door doesn't work
Doesn't work because you have
because the point of entry is a human.
is a deception.
Yes. So here's a typical thing. And by the way, the research group that I work in did some work with black hats. We have a luckily dispensation from the Home Office that we can talk directly to criminals and interview them about the techniques they use. And what they said was, oh, absolutely. The great thing is the people who we make most money from are the ones who are either very fearful of their bosses. So if they get a request from apparently from a great height from the C-suite, you need to do this now, send some money, tell us about this takeover deal, whatever. Or they are embittered and jealous and looking for a job. So the call doesn't come from the C-suite, it comes from a headhunter. I've got a great job for you. I've heard that you're under-recognized in your current role. Um, what would really help me persuade the offerer to give you an interview is if you can tell me some details about what a great job you're doing in your current role. What are you working on? What deals do you have? What level of security access do you have? How much does your employer trust you? All this stuff. And then there's a third one, which is a call, again, typically from the compliance department. But again, who actually knows the face of their chief compliance officer? Not many people, right? And the compliance call comes again typically to a sort of middling junior person who's maybe a bit disaffected, sort of saying, look, I've got the heat on, we've got the lawyers or the auditors coming in soon. I need you to provide this information about this, this process, this deal, this access code, whatever it is. And I'm going to be in real trouble if you could help me, little junior person, because I'm senior and the heat is on me from further up the chain. And the junior person said, oh, I'd really like to help you because then that would reflect well on me and I might get a promotion. I might get some recognition for being a helpful person. And the hackers said to us, do you know what? Those are our most useful people. We hit on them 3, 4, 5 times with the same call. We go back and we ask them for more because they're so helpful, because they think they're being helpful. So
And
actually,
they care
the
about being
basic
helpful.
lesson is this is not IT based. This is people based. And actually, it's the oldest trick in the book. It's a con.
It is,
They're
isn't it?
playing, they're playing their mark like an instrument. They're
And
playing
look,
on fear, on greed, on cupidity of wanting a raise or a better
is it
job or whatever.
isn't it all down to like the personal insecurity, the psychological
Yes,
insecurity? Like I
yes,
want to mean something because I
that's
find
exactly
whenever I feel like I made a fool of myself, that's when
right.
it happened. When
It's
I
even
feel I'm
it's
less
even more
than of,
basic than that, Adam. It's
right?
people want to be loved. They want to belong and they want to be loved.
So just
And
the
the
ego,
criminals have read all the behavioral stuff about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and nudges and all of it. They
all
are
of them.
completely up to speed on the behavioral science of nudging
Totally.
people to get what you want.
Exactly. So isn't it? It's almost like it's like a human development project we're in. Like
Totally
without this technology, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Like all of
right.
those industries, they have
And
a
the key
big
is deep
problem now.
fakes. The
Sorry,
key is deep fakes. So what the
deep
criminals
fakes.
said is, look, all we need is 5 seconds of video of your CEO delivering a speech at the last annual meeting, and we
Mhm.
can then do the CEO. You know,
And what do you think? How do you? What's your prognosis? Because you are there with companies working, right there, the core of it. And
Hmm.
what would be your prognosis of how the will the industries adapt? Because it's a super challenging thing to say. Is not all the tech you're buying is the people who are going,
Sure.
right? Are they how receptive are they?
Okay.
Or how can you see that maybe does it scale in 5 years time or what
Let me tell you. Let me
the
tell you a very
psychological dynamics?
okay.
Yeah, like
I'm going to take an extreme left turn here and tell you a
go ahead.
story about something that happened 200 years ago. So the day in I forget the exact year, around 1830, the day when the first public railway in the world opened
Mm.
in Liverpool, England. The one of the VIP, the major guests who was hosting the event,
Mm-hmm.
was on the launch train. It's kind of hard to imagine this, but no one had ever seen a train before at this stage. No one had seen a passenger train because the technology didn't exist. So just for a minute, stretch your mind. So the local MP, member of parliament, who was one of the kind of party of dignitaries who was launching the opening of the railway, got out of the carriage and stretched his legs and went for a little walk and realized that under his feet there was another line of railway track. So there were two parallel lines. And as he looked up and realized that he was walking on what we now would understand to be the other live rail, another train came along and knocked him down and killed him. So the day of the launch of the new technology, which was the passenger railway, which had not existed before, the very first day of public operation of that new technology, the guy that launched it, or was one of the people who cut the ribbon to launch it, was killed by the technology. Now, I love that story. I mean, I'm very desperately sorry for the guy and his relatives and so on, but it makes me smile because it's a perfect metaphor for what happens with new technologies. We launch them, but we fail to understand the waves they make, the consequences of them.
The second
And
order.
in order to invent rules, we actually have to understand what the basic risk is that the technology presents. You know, you've got to think that the train is traveling at kind of 35, 40 miles an hour in an era that the fastest thing before that was the horse. And even in a sprint horse race, the horse is not traveling more than maybe 30 miles an hour. So this is a thing that a factor of at least 50% is faster than the fastest known moving object up to that point. And therefore, the human brain simply hadn't adjusted to comprehend that. We are, by the way, very good at micro-adaptation. So as a Londoner, I've been very pleased that all of our speed limits have been reduced from 30 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour, which means as somebody who tends to ignore traffic lights anyway, as a, you know, whether I'm on foot or on a bike, I don't need to worry about moving cars anymore because a car moving at 20 miles an hour is not really a hazard. So I'm much more willing to just cross the road at any point. This will horrify, I know if you've got any German listeners who would never dream of crossing the road against the traffic lights. Using my own intuition, I'm much happier now that all the traffic goes at 20 miles an hour that I can completely make sense that I'm not going to be killed by the onset of a car. So our brains are very, very good at actually intuitively processing new risk information, but they're not that good if there's no pre-existing model. So I know how traffic is supposed to work on the road. I mean, I drive, I cycle, I walk, so I know the cadence of all of these different elements of the stuff that's moving on the road. So poor old Mr. Huskerson, the MP who was knocked over and killed by Stevenson's rocket, the train, I should say, he had no mental model of the risk that a train presented because he'd never seen one before that day.
And he could not calculate it also.
Right. And therefore because he couldn't track, he also couldn't predict. He had no data store that said this is the way that trains behave. His model for a moving object was basically, a person on horseback, which is not what a train represents. And he also may have thought, well, okay, the train is coming down the track towards me, but perhaps it's going to stop because it's seen me. Because if you were in the street and there was maybe a horse and carriage coming towards you, the driver would know to swerve out of the way, not to run you over. Clearly, a train cannot swerve out of the way because by definition it runs on rails. But also in those days, brakes consisted of basically a big block of wood that you just jammed into the wheels and hope for the best.
Yes. So are you saying we are about to experience, or many companies are about to experience that moment?
Well,
And
I'm
therefore
saying,
there will be
I'm
a shift.
totally saying that, Adam, we have taken the brakes off. It's just like, we are trying to stop a moving train with a block of wood. Actually, let's just thrash that
Right, that's
metaphor
a
a little
good
bit
metaphor.
harder.
Yeah. And there will be a moment when the collapse will be so advanced, like it will be
Right.
so
So my
obvious and
point is simply
abrupt
this:
that there will be completely
right.
rethinking of the entire problem.
Yes, it will. So there's a long wave theory of risk here, which goes something like this. You could see human progress. I don't know if my screen reversal is going to help here, but is this an uphill track from your point of view? Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
You could regard the history of human progress as like a continuous upward gradient of scientific discovery and improvement.
The Enlightenment.
Or you could zoom the focus slightly closer and look at the track of it. Here we go. Actually,
It
of course, it's
goes,
not a continuous curve.
yeah,
It's like this.
exactly. Yeah.
So you've got, I don't know, the let's take America in the early 20th century. You've got the boom in steel and stock markets and all that, and then actually the markets themselves overheat, and then you get the crash in the 1920s, 30s.
Hmm.
You've got the development of ever more advanced weapon systems, and then suddenly, oh, hang on a minute, we've invented the nuclear bomb,
Yeah.
and we've tried using that in a hostile act, and wait a minute, the whole of humanity just needs to step back and pause.
Exactly.
I would say we're actually in a development now where the totality of what AI can generate, not just the quality or lack of it, but just the quantity. It's like trying, as they said in the early days of the internet, and it's kind of like this times 10,000, it's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Right.
You can't
It's the
actually get a drink of,
magnitude
you
of the,
can't get a drink of water from a fire hose because it's too intense. There's just too much going on.
yes.
And this is the effect of generative AI on human collective cognition.
Plus the curation AI from the
Right,
social media that's still doing that job in a malignant way, and it's
right.
optimized. It is optimized. Tell us more about the risk and optimization and how I believe you would be on board with Gerd Gigeren's work on approximation
Big fan of
versus
Gig Renzer. Yeah,
optimization, right? Because people
yeah.
still
I had the
believe
privilege
within
to
the
share a
tech.
platform with him at a conference last
ex-
year. It was fascinating. It was really really good fun. So I'm a big Gigerenzer fan. For those listeners who are not sort of thoroughly up to speed on this, let me just very roughly approximate what's going on. So you've got the Daniel Kahneman or Kahneman and Tversky camp that says essentially human biases are bad because they distract us from rational decision making. Then you've got Gerd Gigerenz and the Max Planck crowd in the other corner over here who are saying actually we evolved biases into this thing called intuition, which is one of the things that keeps us safe as human animals. So when I talk about crossing the road in front of a moving car just now, I'm not making a mathematical calculation of the risk. My brain is not, apart from being a fairly innumerate person, I don't calculate at that level. In fact, you can't. There are too many variables. But I do know from my experience as a driver, as a pedestrian, as a resident in London, generally how things play out, that I'm not going to be hit by that car because that's not what happens. And therefore, my intuitive prompting says, yeah, I've got time to get across the road without worrying about it. So I'm not in a state of heightened anxiety or calculative risk assessment. I'm just doing it because my
And
intuition
it's
says it's
something about
okay.
embodiment too, isn't it? It's something about embodied perception of that situation
Oh,
because
right.
in so
Which again
many
is what
things,
AI doesn't do. Yeah. So
exact.
there's a bunch of things wrong with AI, which we just need to be very clear about. AI does not do human intelligence in two quite important senses. It doesn't do synthesis, so it doesn't gather information and then infer. It doesn't combine information from different knowledge fields and then make an intuitive leap into a new space. So, like, I don't know, Einstein's theory of relativity, or the discovery of electricity, or Tesla inventing the electric motor, or whatever. You don't take pre-existing knowledge and then kind of make an intuitive leap into a whole new field. What generative AI does apparently very well is a historic sort of all the stuff that we've done up to now. And it can make, remarkably accurate predictions in, for example, the medical space. So it's incredibly good. Things like renal medicine, where the dosage of, kidney dialysis used to be a kind of mystical knowledge that only renal surgeons had. If you now superimpose AI on that form of medical knowledge, it does a much better job. I'm really sorry to any surgeons listening. It does a much better job than the surgeon had done historically, because that actually is a calculative. There's an element of sort of empirical assessment of looking at the patient, but much more it's the calculation of a formula for the treatment for the dialysis that's pumped in. So that kind of thing, AI is incredibly good at pattern analysis from historic data, inferring from historic data. Where it doesn't help us, of course, is where there's a truly unprecedented event. And actually,
Which will
look, we're
be
speaking
increasingly
we're
the
speaking in
case
a
as
week
we
where
go
world
forward.
markets have just been blown up by a particular form of dogmatic intervention from the American administration that's saying, yeah, why don't we just hit, you know, not quite random countries with 50 or even 100% surcharges on their trade. Okay, how's that going to go? Well, we don't know. We had a run at it in the 1930s, and it kind of blew up the economy pretty comprehensively then. Maybe things have changed now in a way that's going to make the experiment work better second time around. What I would say, like I think it was Einstein, it is perhaps a sign of madness to ask the same question and expect a different answer.
Mm.
But hey, let's see how that goes. So back to regulatory development, basically the track of every regulation and every new technology adoption is the same. The new technology arrives, people get really excited, it all goes well for a honeymoon period, and then there's a catastrophic failure.
And would you not say that AI is in qualitatively different from previous ones,
No.
or no?
Why would you say that? It's a new technology. And
Maybe
almost
because
by
no,
definition, new
yeah, but maybe
technologies.
because hang on, but it's a technology. We have not had a technology yet that interfaces with our cognition on such a granular level, I'm
Why
thinking.
is that
No?
different? Why would that make you more optimistic rather than less?
I think in the on the catastrophic side, both catastrophic and the positive, much more radical, I think, than say industrial technology. Um,
But
it
Adam,
conditions behavior,
there's a
but then
second chapter which is quite important here, which is following the catastrophic failure. There is, of course, then a public outcry followed by the politics of, what do we do?
yeah,
The politicians then kind of displace responsibility onto a new regulator. So they create a regulatory agency, which is a very good kind of blame shift maneuver. It's not the politician's problem, it's now the agent's problem. The regulatory agency then proceeds to work very hard on actually just like generative AI, trying to solve the problem that they're now looking at in the rear view mirror. So
yeah,
they bring in controls to solve the failure that just happened
right.
historically.
They have a precedent then.
Right. So they're looking to control to prevent the reoccurrence, the recurrence of the thing that happened before. Meanwhile, of course, the technology's moved on and you get a whole bunch of other things.
Exactly. And isn't this technology like the exponential curve? Isn't it verticalizing,
But yeah, and
increasing compared
this
to
is the
the
thing.
industrial technology, right? And
Right. By any measure, AI, and actually I did a piece with a bunch of defense contractors last year where I created a chart of this. Again, for any science people listening, we're using a unit called petaflops here,
what
which
is that?
is the speed of process calculations per second. So it's a unit of calculative, what do the AI bros call it? Compute. Yeah, so they use this new
Compute.
word, compute.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
the
How much
noun that
compute there
describes
is?
it. Right, okay.
Compute capacity or something. Yeah.
So they use the word compute as a noun to mean this kind of abstract idea of the speed of
Metric.
processing per
Hmm.
second unit calculation. So we're now petaflops, by the way, is and again somebody will tell me this is wrong, but I think it's a 1 with 15 zeros after it in terms of calculations per second.
Okay.
So if by calculation you mean just a simple binary 1 0. And then, of course, you multiply that up into whatever it is, hexadecimals and blah, blah, blah. Now, the human brain is operating. Actually, I think I just had this on a chart. So let me just correct my own maths here. Okay. So the scientists' preferred experimental animal, which is a thing called a nematode worm, which apparently is the lowest form of life that exhibits human-like brain waves, runs at a brain speed of around 12 petaflops. The fastest human brain, so something like a fast jet pilot, this is the example I used with the with the defense contractors, has a brain speed, at full functionality, of around 25 petaflops. What's interesting about the 25 petaflop threshold, so that, if you like, is the ceiling on human rationality, the speed at which we can make sense of multiple complex
Calculative
risks.
rationality is good to qualify.
Right. So a
Hmm.
fighter pilot is actually quite a good example because you would probably say that they're like the apex of human skill in terms of
Computation,
operating an
organic
incredibly
computation.
complex machine in a
Hmm.
three-dimensional, uncertain environment, subject to multiple
Yeah.
unprompted hazards. So
Hmm.
that's kind of the best example of the human brain operating at peak performance, I would suggest, in the face of unstructured risk. Okay. So if that 25 petaflop threshold is like the highest level of compute that the human brain can achieve, what to me was fascinating was a not very well read scientific paper that showed that actually generative AI bashed through that threshold quite recently. So probably last summer, I think when I presented this paper in August, there was some evidence that we'd hit the ceiling, and that actually AI had then blasted through the ceiling and carried on up. And that the most advanced AI, where are we now? According to this paper, which admittedly was projecting a little, was saying by 2030, so another 5 years,
Yeah.
advanced AI will be regularly running at 30 petaflops, which is, 20% higher than the fastest human brain. And by the way, probably 50% higher than the average human brain. It's that story about the
Absolutely.
bear in the woods, the bear
Yeah.
doesn't have to catch the fastest runner, they only have to catch the slowest.
Exactly. Okay. Now, so the master question for us is we cannot compete in compute because we are not
Mhm.
well, those machines are made for computing. We are not exclusively
Sure.
computational. So where do let's bring in intuition and ethics and the
Right.
humane qualities that may be our competitive advantage against machines. What do you say?
Absolutely. So let's first of all consider what is the human as a physical object, which the machine is not. So the human is a bag of, blood, guts, and electrical impulses. The machine is electrical impulses. Okay, so we don't want to compete on electrical impulses. We talked about flops already. But what are the other human advantages? Well, we are sentient.
Mm.
We are active in physical space. We're taking on evidence of our five senses. We're taking on evidence of our social experiences. We can, in very simple terms, we can read the room.
Mm.
So we can sense context. So that when AI is asked, can you give us a good recipe for a cheese pizza? And the AI comes back saying, well, you want to get glue and you want to get cheese and you want to glue the pizza and the cheese together. As humans, and there's a lot of jokes. My son was reading a computer science degree and gave me some examples of early LLM failures from AI models. And it's funny, it's like watching a sort of socially incompetent child trying to understand what's going on. And this is what, 5 years ago now. Clearly, AI has come a long way since then, but what it still can't do is read human context. AI has real difficulty with stuff that humans thrive on, humor, sarcasm, a sense of wonder, a sense of poetry, these kinds of things. And again, this takes me back to my literature training. But what
Right.
a good observer of humanity catches is this idea of emotion and wonder and, love, having
Would you say
fun.
would you say commitment? Right? Like given the
Right.
hinterland of our hinterland of if you
But
remember
Adam,
the
actually,
accent,
you go to a much more important point, actually, which I was going to come on to, and
caring about something rather than
you're
just
right. No, but more than this, it's actually a sense of curiosity.
curiosity.
My dad and his father before him were naval navigators, so they were professional navigators, and they used to talk about why was it that people got into ships and went off the edge of the known world in the 1500s, 14, 15,
Right.
1600s.
And
Why
those
did they
so
do
much
that?
uncertainty, and yet there is
Why did we send people to the moon? You
exactly.
know, and it's that. So an AI, to my knowledge, and I'm very willing to be contradicted on this, I'd be really seriously interested to see a contradiction here. I don't believe that an AI is kind of anything beyond self-seeking. It
Yeah,
answers
instrumentally
right.
motivated, right? We are also instrumentally,
Well,
but
then
beyond
let
that,
me
we are
be even
intrinsically motivated too.
let me be even more basic than that. AI is transactional, and I
Transactional,
agree.
instrumental for me. Yeah. Hmm.
Intrinsic motivation is a very good phrase for it. So, and humans, and again, a lot of the work I do in culture assessment in large organizations is looking for that sense of intrinsic motivation. Again, just to translate for people who are not behavioral psychologists, are people working at their job because they enjoy it, because they feel it gives them something? Or are they doing it for extrinsic motivation? In other words, are they doing it because they just get paid? And again,
Or
going back
the
to that,
status, the
going back to
money,
that
or
45, that horrific research out of Microsoft. If it is true that fully 45% of employees in large organizations are borderline skeptical or indeed full on, don't care, That
Mm.
is terrifying. The implications of that for organized crime, for productivity, for corporate cohesion, for the rules-based order, whatever you want to call it.
Mm.
That really, really alarms me, and it does really make me wonder. And I talked to, it's a good conversation I had with some colleagues at NYU about corporate ethics is not something that you kind of graft on and superimpose into an organization.
Mm.
It has to come in equal parts, kind of top down by encouragement and bottom up by, followership, sense of belonging, doing the right thing. When I say belonging, by the way, I don't mean a subculture of kind of game playing, we're the team that doesn't play
Cult.
with rules.
You mean culture, not cults.
Yeah, I mean collective. What are we here for?
Collectively building
What
and
is it that we're doing? One of my favorite tests when I'm doing board assessments is to say, just go around the table and turn to each of the senior people and say, I need you to think that I'm now a 10-year-old child in the room. I need you to explain to me what you do. What's the value of what you do? And by the way, like a certain type of 10-year-old child who you might encounter at a family party, I'm not going to stop asking you until you've explained to me in terms that I can understand age 10. Because if you can't do that, we need to seriously question whether you understand what is the purpose of what we're doing here.
you mean intrinsic purpose, not only
Yeah.
quarterly purpose, right?
And by the way, this is again, I'm not claiming to have originated this, but I'm very happy to see that this is one of the tests that the finance regulator in the UK, the FCA, now uses for their own culture assessment. It's you need to explain to your customers in terms that they understand. The average reading age of the UK population, by the way, is age 12. You need to think about that,
Mm.
which is on one level a terrible indictment of the education system. It's also fascinating. Okay, and there are some passes, people who are cognitively challenged, people who are maybe using English as their second or third language. Okay. I understand, not everyone is fully fluent in the English language, but even making those allowances is pretty terrible. As an industry, therefore, what we need to do in financial services is get much, much better at plainly communicating what we're doing. So, sorry, again, that's a sidebar about what we're doing in the regulated space. Back to your question about humans. So, what are humans good at? We should not try to compete with machines on pattern assembly. A machine, I've seen some amazing AIs that do, audit tests. So there's a thing called 100% audit now, which is really mind-boggling. When I trained as an auditor back in the 80s, you had to borrow a random number generating machine to then go out and do a sample check of, like 1 in 100, 1 in 200 transactions to verify the transaction. AI doesn't bother with that. It just goes right across everything and does a 100% check on every transaction.
Mhm.
Or, voice trading or whatever the raw material. I think that's fantastic and is a big step forward. So we're not going to beat machines on, pattern analysis. So let's look at what we do. What we do understand is social nuance, rational curiosity. So what you just said, Adam, about pushing the frontiers, just exploring for its own sake. I
Right.
think I think in Silicon Valley they say FAFO management. Just try stuff and see if you get kind of collisions of ideas from different disciplines. Um,
And what about
Unfortunately, we share with machines that we absorb biases and we make assumptions.
Mm.
My really major concern with generative AI is that it's not just copying those biases and assumptions; it's actually multiplying them.
Mm.
Faster than we can keep ahead of it. It's just
Right.
exponentially, as you say,
Creates
multiplying.
noise through it. Yeah.
Right,
White
whether it's
noise,
kind of
right?
social biases, perception filters, assumptions behind statistics, whatever it is.
And that gets fed back onto the web and people
Right, and just amplified.
take
So we had back in the noughties, I used to teach on a course for risk takers in the military, again, where we talked about an old model called the social amplification of risk. Social amplification of risk is the term we used to use to describe news media back in the late 90s, early noughties.
Mm.
Of course, amplification then kind of took off with social media, with the echo chambers that,
Mhm.
of the polarization of opinion. And now, of course, that itself is being massively multiplied by the sheer quantity of stuff coming out of generative AI. How do we push back against this? Well, we do what they're doing in Sweden and Finland, which is we teach curiosity skills. We teach critical thinking. We teach questioning of sources. We teach, again, there's a thing in the UK that we call the military intelligence test, Why is this person communicating this message through this medium to me at this time? And if any one of those five looks not quite right, you've got to think, hang on a minute, you know, why am I being DM'd by somebody in my social
Right.
media,
And also,
asking for my particular expert counter opinion on this thing that they're asserting? That's what's
sure.
that? Where's that coming from?
And also questioning one's own opinions and
Yeah. Oh, sure.
allowing for the possibility that I also might have been deceived. Because when we study, classic
For sure.
experiments in behavioral science, like, Ash and Milgram and all of those classics that leading up to our times, there's always when they ask people, why did you answer like, they were influenced, whenever they were influenced, and the researchers asking, why did they say something? And it never occurs to them that they were influenced. Like, no, no, because they always give a reason that is
Right.
a rubbish reason
But
often.
then we retrospectively construct rationalities for why it's okay that something isn't working. And again, I don't want to talk about America at the moment, but you know, there's plenty of published opinion around that. Um, what you see, and let's talk about a commercial setting I'm very familiar with, which is maybe mis-selling or insider trading in the financial system.
Mhm.
Because the incentives are very direct acting, that the more you make profit, the more you make a bonus. Of
Perverse
course,
incentive.
there's a perverse incentive for people to do insider trading or mis-selling or overselling or whatever. And by the way, the mortgage collapse in 2008 was very much one of the major drivers of that was the taking of a thing called mortgage derivatives, which had been developed as a wholesale bank to wholesale bank product in Wall Street to solve a particular kind of debt shortfall problem. And they were then kind of ripped out and used as a retail trade and sold to like high street customers who shouldn't have been anywhere near that product because it was way too sophisticated and actually based on a very, very narrowly defined form of market risk, which was then kind of misappropriated and resold onwards. So what fascinates me, and we might talk another time, I appreciate the clock is running,
Time. Yes, absolutely.
is that there are people who there is a high level of players, and you do see this in financial markets because there are some extremely bright people and some very clever risk analysts, with or without psychology degrees, who do what we call the amoral calculus. They recognize that if I'm in, let's say, insider dealing and I'm making all this money and getting my bonus, and I've got my mates, my ring of typically you've got 10 traders running an insider ring in the market. They all work for different banks or whatever, and they all know what they're doing. They're trading on WhatsApp, they're using off channel to do the thing.
Mhm.
One of them gets prosecuted by the regulator and fined, $500,000, $1 million. The 10 of them that then get together in a coffee bar or somewhere completely offline and they compare notes. Okay, so each of us has been making 50 million, $100 million a year on this insider ring. The regulators just hit one of us for $1 million for a fine. So actually, the cost of doing business is like maybe it's $1 million a year for one of us. You know, so if there's 10 of us, the probability of getting caught is 10%, and the fine if caught is actually like 2%, 5% of
It's
our
plausible.
margin.
Hmm.
Wow. Therefore, regulation is just a friction cost of doing business. Therefore, so that thing I've just run through for you, that's called the amoral calculus. Again, just put it in plain language. It's like a back of an envelope, you know. So basically, does crime pay? Yeah, it does. So I'm going to go on doing it.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thinking which I wanted to challenge with my own research in the noughties. And I got much closer to cracking that, I would like to say, than had been done by conventional regulation before then.
And have
And
you
that
seen
maybe
have
is
you
the
seen
cue
any
for
improvement? Have you seen improvement post, like after your, let's say, assessment and post interview kind of reassessment of whatever the behavior there was that, and you were they receptive, like some of the bosses,
I
and
would
they
say,
any
talking,
success?
yeah, I'm going to have to wind up a second. Talking polarization, very much the world continues to polarize between those who are let's call it the kind of masters of the universe tendency, those who think that they are untouchable
Mm-hmm. Sure.
and who do, occasionally continue to get busted. So I could mention I'm not going to mention any brand names, but you all know, we read the news. There are some very big brands who've been busted for insider trading. So WhatsApp trading was one of the latest ones that came through that. Staff selection parties based on a night out at the pub. There was the big thing in London insurance markets on that quite recently. So these all kind of weird sort of I don't know, almost medieval kind of behavioral games that markets still use sometimes,
Mm.
which are being flushed out increasingly. Is there a long-term change? I think there is a generic change for the better, but what might, I'm afraid to directly answer your question, it is not as simple as we plugged in this tool and something suddenly everything was fine.
Absolutely. Okay, I appreciate you have to run, but I look forward to the second talk we have planned will be more AI focused, and we'll talk about a specifically malignant kind of AI deception part
For sure.
and all sorts of
We've done a good kind of helicopter fly around some of the
kind of we
topics,
had it,
right?
but yeah, we can rethink that. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and yeah, look forward to speaking next time.
Be great talking to you. Thanks, Alan. See you soon.
Yes, bye.